I'll hit record so we don't need to make comments on obviously performance. But I also need to show you the unsavory amount of tabs I have open on my computer. But remember, when we come down here, guys, after tabs, that's where you guys have got these homework quizzes, and those you can take as many times as you want. So you want to take that. Oh yeah. Well, so here's the thing, like we'll look under the hood. Like literally, it's unlimited attempts and only takes your highest grade. This is meant to give you guys the opportunity to interact with the material in the class with effectively about the lowest of the stakes you can get. So I think each of these are also worth like 10 or 20 points. So yeah, you had a rough day. That's okay. Even if, let's say for the future, you only bat 500 on all the quizzes up here, if you're hitting all of these, homework and review quizzes out of the park, you're probably, 10 out of 10, 5 out of 10, 15 out of 20, you're getting a 75% on the quiz side. And then you've got all the other assignments that are the ones that are going to easily buoy up your grade. So don't get down on yourself.
It's the first time I've been enthused about screwing up.
Hey, stuff happens, man. We're all trying to get through this wonderful pandemic together, and yeah, we don't need to make things worse than they are. So yeah, I'll go ahead. We're going to talk about the Harvard Fatigue Lab, because remember we left off, we got to the Scholander device, we talked about A.O. Atwater, and really we're just talking about the early 1900s, and specifically pretty much right around the Great Depression of the Harvard Fatigue Lab started. And the reason we're going to talk about it for a number of slides is they made massive progress when it comes to doing research and exercise physiology. Not going to insult your guys' intelligence by reading the right side of it. D.B. Dill was the director, and like the guy was impressive to say the least. We'll talk about some of his both physical feats and his research, but a lot of the higher caliber researchers that came through those doors went on to start other major labs throughout the US and throughout the world. So the original point of exercise phys was actually work physiology. So it was studying people that were working, figuring out how long they could do it for, and effectively how well they could perform under different environmental situations, work requirements. And what's fascinating is startup would be the equivalent of getting like I think something along the lines of $5 to $10 million these days, thanks to inflation. L.J. Henderson was one of the other founding individuals. Now, D.B. Dill he did his PhD with Carl Alsberg at Stanford. So this is more of kind of physiology. After the fatigue lab, he would work both at Indiana University and in Boulder, Nevada. And literally the guy was an incredible athlete, hitting a 53-second quarter mile. And this would have been literally in the 1920s into the 30s. So he was an athlete in and of himself. In fact, a number of the other individuals who would work there were actually pretty damn impressive themselves. Sid Robinson is the gentleman. This is an old school metabolic cart, looks totally comfortable with the treadmill that they happen to be on while they're doing metabolic testing. What was really fun is they literally had 2 dogs that worked in the lab, and they would have them they would run on the treadmill for fun because, some dogs are weird like that. And this was one of the first kind of like basic research articles of looking at the effects, or research looking at carbohydrates in the diet versus not, for essentially fatigue. And literally without carbs, the dogs effectively ran for 19 hours straight. With carbs, it was literally 24 hours straight. So the units are not in minutes. No, that's hours. And they were effectively like a Jack Russell Terrier and another Heinz 57. So Sid Robinson would do his PhD at the Harvard Fatigue Lab. Afterwards, he'd move on to Indiana, starting a major research area there. Stephen Horvath would go on to start the lab at UC Santa Barbara. And like the work that Steve Horvath did with a lot of muscle physiology stuff that we still talk about, they had folks, Ansel Keys, among others, that would pass through there, and a lot of other, high quality researchers at one point or another. They were also going out into the field, doing environmental work. I'm sure you guys can assume, just kind of looking at the different locations. Youngstown, that was steel workers. So this was definitely industrial or work physiology. But a lot of the other was literally working and looking at the effects of being at altitude, obviously heat and humidity, or just dealing with heat in different other locations. Now, at about the same time, there was a number of essentially really good researchers specifically looking in the area of physical performance and nutrition out of essentially the Nordic countries. So it's kind of the Scandinavian connection, as you guys can read. So Christensen and Hansen were doing a number of different studies looking on nutrition and physical performance. Ostrand, which we literally still utilize the submaximal cycle test in some classes, and Bank-Saltine was one of the first folks to really go far when it comes to muscle physiology and looking at essentially a little bit with nutrient turnover and intramuscular signaling. So here is Eric Christensen. So literally worked with Krogh, if you guys remember us talking about that, another high caliber researcher who also got a Nobel Prize for the work he was doing, specifically looking at the effects of a lot of things with carbohydrates. We're going to show you guys one of the essentially hallmark studies of the work that they did. Along with Asmussen and Nielsen would be the group that would be referred to as the Three Musketeers. So here's Asmussen, Christensen, and Nielsen. And whenever we talk about old school, taking a higher carbohydrate diet allows folks to train or to exercise for longer periods of time. This is literally what that's based from. So you can actually see the total duration. So 240 minutes for the group that was doing the higher carb diet, only 180 for the low carb or for the moderate carb. And then for the low carb, 90 minutes. Turns out having higher amounts of glycogen stores are really useful for aerobic style to exhaustion work. Problem with that, and not that this work isn't really good, is the fact that when we do work that is literally to fatigue, the problem that we have there is there any sport that we really essentially test people until they hit fatigue? What's the typical way that an athlete is or isn't successful in their sport?
Fatigue.
Well, but fatigue's going to influence performance, absolutely. But are you taking an athlete to essentially full failure where they can no longer keep it up?
No, because you'd risk injury at that point.
Absolutely. Performance has gone down, so they're not going to be going as well. So instead, for example, when we're looking at, say, track and field, it's not till athletes hit fatigue. How does an athlete win a mile run, marathon, etc.? What do they have to do compared to their competitors?
They gotta run faster, like surface level.
So they've got to have a better time, right? So that's one of the other reasons why when you guys are looking at studies, it's not just important to look at this to fatigue work, which, it lets you know, yes, you can last longer, which could be useful for you have a more effective practice, or obviously if you got to do a number of tournament games, be fine. You need to keep in mind it's time trials are really useful. That typically is the better way to look at it, because, if we're going to do the sport of basketball, well, obviously we need to look at like the work output relative to the sport, but for basketball, they're only playing for 40 odd minutes in the college level. The high fat, low carb diet, they would have been fine. How long's a full out routine in cheerleading, Kaylin?
2.5 minutes.
So yeah, turns out, but that's a lot higher work output than we're asking here. And then when it comes to baseball, have you ever heard of a baseball game lasting, and I'm referring to when the ball is pitched till the end of the play, lasting 240 total minutes?
I've played in long games like that, but in college, not usually 240 minutes it's a long time.
But think about it. A lot of the baseball game, especially, for anybody, unless your team is really bad defensively.
Wait, you said 240 minutes? Yeah, no way. That's like almost 4 hours.
Exactly. Of just constant baseball. Not like,
yeah,
you run off, you run on, but
I would say baseball falls in the middle one or the top one. It's definitely not the bottom one, just because there's so much, like me being a pitcher. If I don't play, like if I'm not starting, I'm doing nothing. Like I'm standing around eating.
Yep. However, that's one of the keys when we're thinking about the fueling strategies. If you're a starter, we do want to make sure that you're fully replenished, because, depending on obviously how your coaches like to bring in relief and everything else, there's a chance you might be up on the mound for quite some time.
Yeah.
And another thing to keep in mind when we talk about the fatigue, is think about how much of a percentage of fatigue you can have and still be effective at your sport. So for example, if we were to look at, say, a golfer, because I enjoy making fun of golf sometimes, and that's not really fair. A golfer can lose maybe 10, 20% off their driving distance, but as long as they're still, doing all the other skills, putting well and everything else, they're probably going to be okay.
Yep.
How much percentage as in speed do you think you can have off of your fastball, slider, changeup, etc., before you're getting pulled off the mound?
It depends the pitcher, but I would say a few, like when it's noticeable to the other team where like they start hitting you. Like if you were, let's just say, like 90-92 for 6 innings and you were flawless, and then that next inning rolls around and that first pitch is like 87 and it gets sent to the wall, like, yeah, that's a problem.
So think about it. If you've gone from 87 to 92, that's like a 6% loss of your velocity.
Yeah.
So I mean, think about it. Some other pitchers, they lose just a 2%. They're throwing batting practice. They're no longer pitching.
Yep. Literally.
So, but getting to, once again, the foundational science is good. We have to keep in mind where it's applicable and what populations working with. So here's a picture of Olaf Ostrand and Bengt Saltine, who he was alive into the early thousands, into the teens. So when we're working through this area, this is when now we're starting to figure things out. Like we understand we need our nervous system in order to move. And it turns out whenever you start working out, your breathing is going to become deeper and at a higher rate. Turns out if we're going to exercise, we're going to be in better cardiorespiratory fitness in general, and how we're going to have that bigger cardiac output, all the things that a lot of you guys are familiar with, but this is effectively the individuals, knows Krogh again, and Lidhard doing the foundational work. Now, activation of the sympathetic nervous system, we're talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine being released with exercise in the higher essentially intensities. Autonomics, so we're talking about the parasympathetic effect of decreasing our heart rate and sympathetic increasing our heart rate, and how that's going to affect essentially the stress our body's under at rest. And literally, you're getting information now on strength data, which it had a stop for a while. We'll get to that when we talk about Karpovich in a few, which is, there was a little bit of research and strength work, but unfortunately, one of the big proponents of it died of a heart attack. And that made everyone think that cardio work was going to kill you. So it kind of stopped for a while. But understanding essentially how fatigue isn't setting in, what's effectively the cause of soreness, how we're going to have lower performance when we have higher amounts of lactate just because of that decreased pH effect. And then, the good old work of Hill looking at the total amount of work we're doing. Now, more work on the cardiovascular system, essentially really understanding what's going on with essentially how the body's going to respond to acute training, how it's going to respond when it's recovering, and then understanding effectively how training is going to start to change parts of the body. Yes, and it doesn't stop. A lot of these things we're going to touch on again and go further on in depth, but just kind of understanding who are the folks that did this foundational work. Now, what's really interesting is this is where we're further elucidating that carbohydrates are the big part. Because remember, up until the 1800s, they thought it was protein was the big part there. How exercise is actually going to increase your red blood cell count. That's what the erythrocytes means. And increase hemoglobin. So the protein that carries oxygen inside of it. How we're going to get better at measuring body temperature change. Yes, that is what you think. And yes, it is as miserable as you would think to have to do your temperature that way. Don't worry, we will never do that in my lab. I can tell you stories about it. But I prefer do those in person because they're graphic. They're a little poopy. My apologies. And also what's interesting is how we're going to get a actual change in elevation of our immune cells from essentially exercise. And that's a good thing. We actually have seemingly a better immune function when we happen to be being physically fit. So the American College of Sports Medicine, that's the group that made the book that you guys have. And effectively, this was going to be founded the same year that Huxley and Hansen described the sliding filament theory. So this is going to be the shortening of how muscle works. And Roger Bannister ran the first mile in less than 4 minutes. So literally it started as a small offshoot of what was essentially the American Association of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation, and then would grow off to being its own component, which, yeah, to this day is now having, well, I guess obviously with COVID, we did not have the meeting anywhere near recently with the full numbers of what's been there in the past, but it's something that's grown immensely since its beginning. Now, in the 60s going forward, we have reintroduction of what is known as the muscle biopsy. And so this is actually using a needle to actually pull a little bit of muscle fiber out. So you're going to be able to look at a lot of things going on inside of it. So this is going to be Bergstrom, which literally the Bergstrom needle is named after, in Holtman. Duchenne, as in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, he was one of the first to kind of come up with it. And this is how he's able to examine muscle fibers. And so what you do is, this is a needle with a point. So you use the scalpel to cut the skin open and then cut through the fat and cut the fascia of the muscle open. The needle goes into the muscle belly itself. There's an internal needle that is going to clip a little bit of muscle through the notch in it. And when you pull the muscle out, you can freeze it. You can treat it with chemicals. You can look at single fiber force production. You can look at genetics. You can look at intramuscular signaling. You can look at protein concentrations. You can look at fiber type. You can look at a wide variety of things. It allows a lot of really good information. However, they are uncomfortable. I've had 3 done in my life as just part of being in the lab, and they needed a sample. I can tell you guys all about that also as well at some point in the future, but once again, kind of graphic, don't want to report it. Now, the reason this is really useful is when we pull out that muscle, we freeze it immediately, we can then analyze it. So what's really interesting is looking at doing a biopsy, and this would be effectively, you can see from Bergstrom in the 60s, when they actually took the sample first and then had folks do a time to exhaustion. So it's, once again, as long as you can last during an aerobic task. They found that individuals that had higher initial muscle glycogen levels were able to endure for much longer periods of time. So really showing the importance thereof. Now, the first true human performance lab would have been effectively in the 1960s by Ellsworth Buskirk. And this would later go on and be changed to the Knoll Physiological Research Center. This was at Penn State. The second was going to be at Ball State University, and this would have been by Dave Kostel, who is obviously another major heavy hitter. In fact, they did a lot of research with cosmonauts and astronauts. So they did a lot of work through NASA to deal with the massive amount of muscle mass loss and even bone mass loss that you have when you're effectively out in space, along with work with aging populations, which had some problematic situations when you're looking at some of the aging population information, but it was still very good. And I'll explain what that is whenever we get to that also as well in the class. Now, as far as in exercise biochemistry, Halsey, we're talking about mitochondrial function along with biogenesis. That means literally increasing how that increases with training. Sorry, I got my other notes down here so you can see it. And then also a little work on caloric restriction. Phil Golnick was looking at how looked at some of the foundational work on how fiber type changes with training. So you do see a slight shift in those fast fibers, slow fibers, which we're going to get into more as we get into the muscle phys. And then as far as physiology and physical education, Peter Karpovich started the lab in Springfield College. And this guy, I am also a giant fan of, because literally he was one of the folks that I told you before was a giant proponent of the only thing you needed to do is aerobic training. And then if you did any resistance training, your heart was going to explode and you die. And so the York barbell team, led by Bob Hoffman and the rest of the lifters there, Grimick was one of their big lifters at the time, put on essentially an exhibition of showing Olympic lifting, which was a very weird thing that not a lot of people did at that time. And then afterwards, Karpovich thought he'd come out and show them up and be like, oh, they're too muscle bound, they can't move. And this was, unfortunately, he tried to do this to Grimick, where Grimick had all the mobility to do everything he did, could also then with his legs straight, bend over and touch both of his hands, palms to the ground, and then press himself up into a handstand and hold that position. After that, he then stood up and did a standing backflip, to which Karpovich realized that he lost and walked away. But the guy was big enough to admit, after he had been told that lifting weights was going to make you slow, weak, or slow, too muscle bound, that you couldn't move, you'd be too tight, and then he was proved wrong. He actually went to the barbell folks afterwards. It's like, okay, I'm obviously wrong, and I need to figure out where I made these mistakes. And then proceeded to effectively be one of the major researchers in resistance training into what would effectively have been, essentially the 1950s and 60s. And that's now how resistance training part is catching up. Now, TK Curitin, who was interesting because he was first a swim coach at Springfield and then later would start the lab at the University of Illinois. He was literally the PhD advisor of Hal Holmes. Hal Holmes, which you'll see a picture of later, is literally the guy that this lab is named after, because he was the exercise physiology faculty for, I guess, close to 3 decades. Now, because I'm going to go through my pedigree, we're going to talk a little bit about the University of Kansas. And actually, the first person to be effectively the director of phys ed there was a guy by the name of James Naismith, who literally did the sport of basketball. This really upsets UK fans because I get to tell them that your school means nothing. No, I'm kidding. It was more along the lines of the fact that literally the sport was started in Springfield College, but he was literally the head coach of Kansas and would teach, who would then be also another faculty member, Fogg Allen, who literally the place that the Kansas, see the banner right there, the Jayhawks play in to this day, and would win a number of national championships. Now, this was while he was being the department chair. So he was literally teaching classes, working full time, to which I wish more of our coaches had to teach classes, because I think we'd all get along a lot better. Now, after he retired, Wayne Osnes would be the department chair for literally the next 25 years, direct the exercise phys lab, and he was emeritus. I need to check and see if he's still kind of going around well, but he was essentially a good researcher in himself, who then would hire what would be Joe Donnelly and Phil Gallagher, and these were guys that I had a chance to work with, as in these. Joe Donnelly ran what's known as the Energy Balance Lab, so he happened to be, it's more about weight change. He was also the department chair for about 4 years before he moved on. Dr. Gallagher is now a full professor, does research on muscle physiology and a little bit on how essentially the body responds to exercise. Now, my PhD advisor is Andrew Fry. He was also a department chair for a little bit there as well. So it turns out no one's wanted to do 30 years straight ever since essentially, Osnes got done. And then also working under Trent Herta, who worked with some folks, and he did his PhD at Oklahoma. Now, when it comes to EKU, Hal Holmes was the exercise physiologist here literally for over 30 odd years. And then Jack Rutherford also filled the role and then made the poor or good decision to hire me. So that kind of lends itself to effectively how a number of different individuals who were essentially the advisor to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation, and how kind of the science is not just developed, but you can kind of see how the tutelage has moved through. And so that effectively ends the basic history lesson that we have over exercise physiology. So now it makes a little bit more sense where you see how we've got the chemistry, we have the physics, we have the biology, we even have a little bit of sociology and otherwise, and essentially what all led into what created exercise physiology. And like anything else, we've seen it being utilized as ways to research how folks can work better. I'm sure you guys have seen the thing about doing standing desks or walking desks is to help improve, essentially performance in individuals that are trying to work, as well as the positive effects of exercising, adding more exercise to your daily routine. And it's just all coming down to different applications of the same information. So that, like I said, is the entire history lessons we wanted to do. Obviously, I want to give you guys plenty of time to do the lab. What questions, comments, concerns you guys have for me about anything we covered over the history?
don't have any questions. I just know now that we did this, some of like the human lab and the Scandinavian thing, like if I would have seen this PowerPoint before I took the quiz, because like I have it written down here, like those questions were in it.
Mhm. Yeah.
You have now cracked the code to studying for my quizzes, my slides.
Yeah, like that, the dog one, pretty much all of them, honestly.
So when you're talking about putting in your abstract, this is all we're really looking at. So background, you can literally see it's all of 3 sentences.
Mhm.
Like why I want to do the research on the effects of energy drinks on performance. Purpose is just 1 sentence. So for you guys, your purpose is effectively going to be, what effect does drinking 20 ounces of water do to change my body count?
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we used a lot more subjects, 17 and 15, so we had a total of 32. You guys are probably going to, hopefully the other 2 students are alive. And then we're going to go ahead and have, so you'll be like, essentially 4 participants. And then you've got the demographic stuff, average height, that standard deviation is the second part, average weight. We're going to do it all in kilograms
Mhm.
and meters. So it's okay. Just a little conversion, how old. And then actually, well, here you go. I actually literally did body comp testing. So you can see how that was set up in there. Only you guys obviously are going to do reaction time tests and all this other stuff. So yours is going to be a lot shorter. It's going to be like, we did, body comp through an impediment or through a BIA device, through handheld calipers, through the bod pod, and hopefully the DEXA timing works out for all this. So, and then we retested. You're going to do some form of stats. So you have a little bit of segment on the end that talks about statistics. For you guys, probably going to be a t-test. You're just comparing the 2 tests. That's it.
Okay.
And then your results. Obviously, we had a lot more results. So that's why that's really beefy. Yours is going to be pretty simple. So we got pre-body composites, post-body composites by things. Nothing was significant. Everything was insignificant. Some things were significant, whatever it comes up with. Okay. And you see, I put the p-values in there of where different things hit on. So you can kind of see the levels. And then like a basic conclusion.
Okay. Okay. That makes more sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Where do we find these classroom lectures on Blackboard?
So that's going to be, let me pull that back up.
Because I had no idea how to find this in all
That's
my
why we're talking about it. That's under course documents. So you go through course documents and you're going to find all this stuff. Now, notice I forgot my oldest. Sadly enough, I keep all the old presentations because I want to make sure that no one plagiarizes in the future. So I can always pull up the old ones that my students did. So I guess you guys know that now. Actually, I'm gonna stop recording.